It's my great pleasure to introduce Dan Bachenheimer, who will take us through the next discussion session. There is Dan, smart with his cap. He is a director of the Biometrics Institute, but in his day job, and it's a long title, Dan, it says his Accenture's Digital ID Innovations Global Technical Lead, and he designs, operates, analyzes biometrics-based identity management systems globally. Is there time for anything else in your life if you're doing all this? I seriously wonder. So Dan, look, I'll hand over to you. We'll invite the other panelists then to come online, but I'll leave it to you to take us from here into the discussion about biometrics and hygiene. And I would love to encourage people in the chat forum. Some of this is quite controversial. I mean, you know, we have Patrick there later and we'll talk about masks, but I have had things in my inbox from people I may say that I don't know who have promised me all kinds of things, the technology vaccine. Dan, over to you.
Right, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And yeah, I share Mahos's wishes that everybody is keeping safe along with their families. So joining Mahos for this panel discussion, we have Alexandra from World Food Program, who's the regional scope coordinator for their beneficiary services, and Sam Jeffries from UNHCR, who's their senior registration and identity management officer. And I know that he also has been running the UNHCR's biometric identity management system, which is, I believe, has pushing 10 million unique identities that they've enrolled in over 40 countries. So that's pretty incredible. So the theme of this panel discussion, you know, again, you know, with the COVID-19 pandemic, you know, we're all keenly aware of how this deadly virus can easily and rapidly spread, and how hygiene and social distancing play important roles in combating the spread. But what is the impact on the use of biometric systems and associated risks? So we want to kick off the panel basically with a more practical, discussion on, given your use given your use or involvement with biometric technologies pre-COVID-19, what have you done or plan to do differently in response to COVID-19? And this kind of goes to what Mahos' last points were on adapting, to hygiene, a more hygiene-focused approach. So that's what we want the panel to discuss. And why don't we start off with Alexandria? So, what do you view your changes, or what have your changes been, or you anticipate your changes to deal with this COVID-19, this spread?
Yeah, thank you, Dan. It's a pleasure to participate to this panel, and I hope I'm audible.
Yes, we can hear you well.
Fantastic. So what just to set the scene here a little bit, pre-COVID, WFP, we're running several operations by using some kind of biometrics. So be it picture, be it fingerprints, and most recently iris, to support the authentication at the moment of redemption of humanitarian assistance by the beneficiaries. That was quite necessary because a very important number of our beneficiaries does not have any type of national or government delivered ID in order to identify them, right? So whenever WFP is intervening, we're serving very vulnerable populations, very, very, very far from the capital cities, do not have access to social services, so we have to identify them in a certain way. And so WFP is delivering this functional ID and using biometrics to make the link between the person that we targeted for the assistance and the person that actually comes and gets the assistance. So The organization is quite mature in the usage of biometrics as far as WP is concerned, and what was quite a very positive trend, in my opinion, in recent years is that we had having more and more informed discussions and assessments with the usage of biometrics, meaning that we're not looking into a blanket usage of biometrics anymore. We really have to look at what is relevant for a given operation. And we also have to balance between, of course, this need for end-to-end assurance that biometric can provide to a certain extent, and also our internal guidance on data minimization, which indicates us that we only need to gather a very minimum information, always with a focus to protect the beneficiary and their privacy. So for each usage of biometrics, since it's a person identifiable information, we need to provide some justification. Then when COVID happened, of course, very quickly there were questions and concerns related to the usage of contact-based biometrics, specifically equipment, and we had to adapt very quickly. We had to adopt the process, we had to adopt the operation procedures and the technology. Together with this, an important effort on the advocacy had to be done to our donors who are financing the activities of the World Food Programme, also to assure that for the duration of the crisis, we're entering a specific emergency mode. And it's the first time we're facing such an emergency where we also have to balance a pure health risk to which we may be exposing the beneficiaries by using our internal tools, and the financial risk to which the organization might be exposed if we're removing this part of the assurance. So a lot of sensitization had to be done to donors, also to maintain the trust. So that was another effort. As was presented, I'm covering the West and Central Africa region for WFP. It's 19 countries. We're going anywhere from Senegal up to Central African Republic. And out of 19 countries, 10 are among the poorest, the least development with countries in the world. So going with this, of course, the health system present in those countries are also extremely weak. And what's making it much more challenges is that even in those weak health systems, the access of the people we serve to those systems is even more reduced because we're addressing the most vulnerable populations. So of course, WFP could not take a risk to contribute to the virus spreading through our equipment, and we had to adjust very quickly. So what we did is there was a risk assessment done with a lot of countries in my region, where we were looking at what is the real risk that we might be exposing our beneficiaries to by continuing using the usage of contact-based biometrics, and to understand what this risk was versus the financial risk. Following the analysis, many countries have temporarily suspended the usage of contact-based biometrics. We mainly are using fingerprints in my part of the world, there's a lot of challenges. Mahus was just talking about it. It's of course, with the proper hygiene measures, we can reduce the risk quite drastically. But again, in the very remote areas we are operating, we don't always have access to the health product or to hygiene product to clean those fingerprint scanners, etc. So we had to adjust very quickly, and in many operations, as I said, we have suspended the usage of fingerprints. In some countries, this process was actually requested by the host government. It was the example of Burkina, who in our region was one of the first to register positive COVID cases, and very quickly they were victims of the virus. So the government proactively suspended the usage of fingerprints for all actors, be it humanitarian or commercial. So of course, WFP aligned. In other countries, such as Nigeria, there were rumors and echoes that the government would eventually request for suspension of biometrics. but the UN actors actually took a lead on it. IOM was the first one to suspend it, and we aligned as well. So I think I would just finish my my response by saying that in such an emergency, it has been accepted to face maybe a higher financial risk for a defined period of time. And here, defined period of time is the most important message, where we already see our senior leadership asking us as operational teams on when we're going back to a more assured type of delivery. And what's important here is not a timeline, but truly this messaging is that we all accept that for a defined period of time, we were more concentrating on doing no harm and doing directly no physical or health harm to the people we serve, but that this cannot become the new normal. So the post-COVID world will not be the one where we do not use biometric, but most likely, how do we adapt it and look what is the medium-term future for the usage of contact biometrics or contactless biometrics. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. Yeah, so I that's interesting. The financial impact, and I guess in this case, you know, we're in general we use biometrics to be assured that the or to reduce identity fraud, basically to reduce that kind of leakage, that fraudulent use. So by stopping fingerprint biometrics, okay, so we're potentially increasing identity fraud, which can have a financial impact. So that's really interesting, and you adapt it quickly. So now we'll turn it over to Sam to speak on the same subject. So in your day-to-day operations, if you think about what you did pre-COVID and how you're adapting to that, kind of as Alexandria explained, you know, which could be and she covered all areas, and we discussed briefly. It could be, you know, not just technology, but also policy around that and process changes. So take it away, please, Sam.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks again to the Institute for having UNHCR join the panel today. So I will just spend a minute, I think, recapping, as I think it's important, on what UNHCR is currently doing in the space of refugees and biometrics, or at least what we were doing. At the moment, more than 80% of all refugees worldwide who are managed by UNHCR with host governments now have a biometric identity held by us. So those individuals are spread across 73 country operations worldwide. And in each geography, we're working closely with the governments, as well as with other partners such as WFP and financial service providers and other entities. So refugee registration is the core of our mandate, and the identity management process and the distribution of aid associated with that, we see as critical components of our refugee protection work. But those activities have traditionally been associated, especially in the large camp-based settings, with crowds and confinement and the shared use of equipment such as biometric scanners. And so there's also regular handling of things, of documentation such as ration cards and ID documents in going about our daily business to serve those who are coming to us for registration, but also coming about for services on an ongoing basis. And just to give you one example, our camp in Bangladesh has around 1 million people residing in it, and has a population density 50% higher than that of Mumbai. So you can start to imagine the potential for crowding each month when every household needs to come back through our centres and that of our partners to receive aid and assistance. So for many operations, we see really that COVID-19 and the challenges that it brings as an emergency on top of an emergency. So it has been a challenge, no doubt, for us to try and manage this. Our High Commissioner, along with other principals of other agencies, issued a statement to reaffirm that as a staff, as an agency, we would be staying and delivering, and we would be drawing upon our existing crisis management capabilities to sustain our programs, but more importantly, to step up and support local governments and local communities to help meet the emerging challenges. We've seen the number of new registrations across our operations globally dropped by 60% in the first 2 months of the crisis, which is huge, undeniably. And this can be attributed largely to border closures, changes in national legislation, access to transport, lockdowns. But generally, the wars and the conflicts haven't stopped. And as an agency, we still have many millions of people who are already registered with us under our care, and we need to look at ways of helping them on an ongoing basis, as well as looking at more innovative ways to facilitate the registration and biometric onboarding for those who are still managing to flee violence and persecution. So I suppose in terms of setting the scene, that's where I'd go. But in terms of what we've done differently in the last couple of months, I think we've had to consider the whole process for our interactions with refugees, and not just the short part of it, which involves biometrics. So we have instigated what you would probably expect us to do in terms of social distancing, and we've doubled rations and given out increased cash allowances to reduce the frequency of interactions with beneficiaries. And we've also put a lot of resources into rapidly training and deploying healthcare workers and sanitation assistants, and installing simple things like additional hand washing facilities, in as many places as we can. And as Alexandra touched on, things like running water and easy sanitation just aren't given in many of the places that we work. So we've also had to evaluate how we deliver our services. And I think, at least from my side in managing our systems, it's made us appreciate the various different data elements that we have collected and how we can use them in order to deliver those services. And I think there's some really interesting conversations that we can have around that. And so some of the changes I think we know are temporary. Alexandra touched on fingerprinting, and for us, we run a multimodal system in the majority of our operations, and I think we accept that we have now suspended the collection of contact fingerprints in almost all circumstances, but not all circumstances, where there's still a life-saving need, or it can be linked to life-saving protection and civil registration, and we would still do that. But in most circumstances, we've suspended those activities. And running a multimodal system, I think, has allowed us just to be able to switch over to doing iris only overnight in the majority of all operations now. So that's been a real advantage to us. I think we've also made other changes which have worked surprisingly well and with little friction or negative operational consequence. So the majority of our operations were previously using iris scanners, which were the hands-on goggle type, so they were not at all contactless. And so we've had to adapt these to be contactless by simply taking off the goggle. And yeah, it's not an ideal solution in terms of focal length, but it's something we've been able to roll out overnight, and we've even sent guidance to the field on how to make tripods for these stands out of sticks and out of nails on the walls, those kind of things, to try and allow us to respond to these challenges overnight without needing to go through the more complicated procurement and shipping and logistics processes of rolling out new technologies. So our response time's definitely been an important factor. Some things, though, I think are important to point out that we've not had to do differently. So our iris biometric authentication, especially in the Middle East, has been contactless for some years already. And we've thankfully been able to maintain this because it is contactless. And we've still been able to carry on providing that same biometric identity assurance to other humanitarian partners throughout the crisis. I'll wrap up just a last point, I suppose, from me in terms of what we're thinking about for the way forward, and I think it would be good to explore this a bit more with the other participants. But I think we're now seeing more of our work go towards self-service and provision of services and appointments and onboarding by remote. And with lockdown, this has been a necessity, but I think it's also just been a long time coming and something we should have been advancing on for quite a while now. So trying to get that sort of same level of assurance for those people who we know, but also the people who we don't know yet, is a key challenge for us that we're looking into as we move forward.
Dan, I just jump in here for a moment. I'm the facial recognition tool, and we have an intruder. Simon, if you can please turn your camera off, because we've only asked speakers to come online. So it's lovely to see you, but if you could please, we can all see you at times. So I would suggest please turn your camera off. Dan, I'm handing back to you. I can't dismiss him. and it would be impolite. Thank you.
Thanks. And there's several questions come in, but I do want to ask Sam and Alexandria one that Eva raised. What are the typical obstacles for changing the type of biometrics used? Now, Alexandria, you said you just deprecated fingerprint for now, understanding the financial impacts, and Sam, you deprecated fingerprint because you had alternative modes already. But in general, I think that that's an interesting question. And in your experience, if you wanted to introduce, let's say you didn't have the option just to stop, but what if you had to change either not just the modality, but even if you stuck with fingerprints and went with contactless, or if you did change the modality, how do you see that impacting your operations, and what's the hurdle to make that happen? And let's start with Alexandria.
Thank you. It's we're jumping a little bit ahead, but that's a very relevant question. From truly nitty-gritty operational point of view, there are several things that you have to take into consideration. Changing from one type of biometric to the other, in my experience, in our context, represents several challenges. First would be very simple. How do you explain this change to the population you serve? Again, in the places where WFP operates, we're running quite a lot of consultation with the communities and community leaders. And usually this could be a focus group discussions. It could be a couple of days meetings where everybody's sitting around and we're talking about the way that WFP will now be serving them, listening to their concerns, explaining the concepts of biometrics, of what is the personal information, what is privacy, etc. A lot of those concepts are not yet natural, especially in the part of the world when I work. In West and Central Africa, there is not a lot of understanding what the personal information would be. Oftentimes, we have to spend quite a lot of time on explaining what those are. And very simply, in COVID world, the crowding are not possible. So we don't have this possibility to bring people together and discuss and explain and listen to their concerns. And often we don't have any access to media or the beneficiaries for this matter. So there's this part of the community acceptance and explaining the changes that would be coming that is extremely challenging.
Yeah, very.
Yeah. Another point is very basically the supply chain, meaning that if tomorrow we wanted to move from contact-based to contactless, if WFP wanted to move all of their operations to iris, I'm putting aside all the protections, policy changes, all other, but truly from the administrative point of view, in today's reality, supply chains all around the world have been disrupted. So we cannot get the hardware on the ground. And with the travel bans, we cannot even use our last resort delivery option, which always has been someone jumps on a plane with 2 luggage full of scanners, right? Today we do not have this possibility. So that's another challenge. And of course, not forgetting about the fact that on top of the emergency, it's a unique emergency. We never faced anything like this. We already have our staff is already operational staff is extremely stretched.
Right.
So adding something new processes, new policies, new ways of doing testing, because we're not yet sure that the new technology would actually be working quite well on top of everything that they have already on their plate, could also set us to failure. So that's why the kind of a WFP direction has been adopt what you have, as Sam has said, sustain what you have, scale up whenever possible, but be very careful with piloting new things or switching from one to another.
Okay, and Sam, briefly, if if you could respond to Eva's question as well, like your hurdles to introduce new tech, and that was interesting. Alexander started off with the grassroots, starting with the with the people that are going to be subject to the technology. That's interesting.
Thanks. Yeah, it is a good question, and I think part of it comes down to the use case we're looking to meet. And I think for us, we often need to consider whether or not we're doing something to help establish uniqueness and build an identity and reestablish an identity for somebody, and have data which can be deduplicated against a larger data set and potentially at a later point in time integrated into a civil registry, versus something which could be a bit more functional, a bit more smaller scale, something that could be used for sort of one-to-one or one-to-few validation going forward. So I think that's a consideration. In terms of other obstacles that would stand in our way, I mean, we would not, I think Alexandra touched on it, there are a lot of legal implications for deploying any new technology, and we wouldn't want to let a technology sort of lead the way without there being a good use case for it. So we do, in accordance with our data protection policy, insist upon DPIAs being undertaken for each new systematic use of data and collection and processing of data. So that would have to be done. I think on the technology side, we'd look to make sure that we're not rolling out something which just disregards the previous data that we've collected. You know, we have enormous holdings, and we wouldn't want to sort of start again. But at the same time, we wouldn't want to just miss an opportunity to use a new technology where it could offer us benefits. So I think there's privacy, portability, especially if it's going to be something, and back to the self-service point, if this is something which we're looking to roll out for the beneficiaries themselves, and having access to the technology, so something which is smartphone based or even not, as lots of people do not have smartphones, is something to be considered, and just how easy it is to use and how reliable it can be compared to our existing modalities and biometrics.
Okay, very good. You know, the second topic area, you know, we focus right in on contactless versus contact. Majos has spoken a lot about this, and Patrick is going to speak to the one of the points that Majos brought up, the accuracy and the impacts of that, and why not move to smartphone based? Well, again, Patrick will talk a bit about that. And then one thing I just want to interject here, when Majos was doing his presentation, he showed the two gloved hands. Now, I remember it was 20 years ago now when Dr. Schneider brought in one of his ultrascan devices. He showed me that he could image, get friction ridge images through a nitrile glove. This was 20 years ago. Now, ultrascan didn't get out in the industry much. I know they did some work up in Canada where they put an ultrascan device outside, and where it got snow on it, and they were still able to identify the truck drivers that were using to gain access to the train depot. But and I know since then the technology has been bought out by Qualcomm. But I don't know, maybe Majos, do you come across that type of technology where it's still contact, but you can wear a glove? I mean, has that come back since COVID-19 in your research?
Okay, so now I'm unmute. Okay, so yes, I've heard the stories. I was not aware that 20 years ago. I guess I was too young to see that, but there are studies online about contactless biometrics, and I don't know if in the commercial side what is going on, but I cannot say for sure. As an academic, I would prefer to go and do a thorough research and give back some a better answer by doing this research first. But I would go to at least what Patrick was saying. I mean, one thing that is for sure is whether we use contactless or contact-based. Studies are necessary to determine what is valuable to use and at what scenario. So since we know from NIST that contact-based are always much better, this has been taken into consideration. However, that doesn't mean that we cannot use contactless under certain conditions, and cell phones, as I said, and according to again the NIST study, is the lowest in terms of accuracy. It is possible. You can do a good job with it. There are certain details in the study. If you go clearly, so in the report that from Patrick, there's a section 5.1 talks about metrics, and section 5.2 about matching, and they're clearly talking about you know, the contactless matching is much improved when considering multiple fingers. You can use you cannot assume that treating each finger for multiple times, taking multiple captures, this will be realistic, and so you have to consider other approaches in terms of capturing and matching using fingerprint sensors. For contactless devices, smartphone applications, the challenges are optimizing for focus and lighting of index and middle fingers to produce the best results. Maintaining focus of 4 fingerprints simultaneously is difficult because of the small depth of field of smartphone cameras. So these are just the conclusions of the study when using smartphones or other contactless fingerprint sensors. If you use gloves, and then the conditions of conduct the study, whether the gloves are dirty, there is other consideration, whether the gloves and the hands are dirty when you use the gloves.
Yeah, and that's why I was wondering if in your research, did you come across that, but it sounds like you haven't. Okay, just contactless in general. So, okay, and then kind of, you know, to one of the questions about UNHCR and self-service, but also going back to one of the points that Sam said is that it really depends on the use case, and basically what Majos is saying, what we'll see Patrick talk about in the results is, yes, for some use cases, if you're doing a one-to-one verify, then based on your use case, maybe that would be sufficient. But if you're trying to deduplicate a population of thousands or tens of thousands, maybe not. But I don't know, Sam, when one of the questions was, you know, how would you use a self-service in UNHCR, but maybe on top of that, like if one of those use cases was contactless, have you considered that as part of your self-service, and where do you see that fitting in, as an enrollment operation or a simple verify operation? Could you talk to a bit of self-service in your context?
Sure, I'd be glad to. Thanks. It's a good question. So I think already we've seen a large increase in our remote delivery of services, and by that I mean just simply speaking to people who we already know over things like WhatsApp and Teams and Skype and Zoom to do these initial interviews. But that doesn't help us with the level of assurance that we need to change any information or to do the more sensitive services that we provide. And it certainly doesn't help us to do the normal registration that we would undertake when face-to-face and when we could collect biometrics. In terms of self-service, so I just wanted to differentiate there between sort of remote services and self-service. We see it as being hugely valuable, and I think the parallel that can be drawn is from the high street banks on people not having to come in to see us to get an update on their status or to ask things. Pilots so far, and we're looking into things, including contactless fingerprints, but we have not piloted that yet. And we're also open to other ways of assuring identity. I mean, we traditionally we did a facial recognition pilot years ago, and I think the people on this call won't need reminding to say that it wasn't particularly successful. I think it was about 7 years ago or so. So compared to where we are today, I think facial could be another avenue for us to do a verification to prove that somebody is who they're asserting to be. But going forward for new enrollments, I think we still need to. It's something we're still working out. I think we need to be. We're looking into sort of levels of assurance frameworks and trying to establish how we can get people on board with our services and deliver as much as we can but in a way which doesn't affect the data integrity of the data that we have already got, nor put those people who have data in the system at undue risk. So it's a balancing act, and not an easy answer or an easy way forward, I'd say.
Oh yes, yeah. Thank you. That's great. And I wanted to go back to Alexandria, but if I could just ask Isabel, I think we've kind of consumed our time budget at this point. Is that correct? Should we move on now?
No, you still have time, Dan. I know you're wanting to break the record of timekeeping, I guess. So you still have more time to go through. We said at 12:30 we would open up for chatting.
I thought it was on the top of it.
Absolutely. Keep going.
Oh, okay. Well, great. So then, the third subtopic area in this context is balancing risk and practicality. We wanted to talk about that. Now, some of that is the introduction of new technology that we talked about, and some of the risks and practicality we spoke about. So some of the risks are the financial impact versus identity fraud, and some of the practical matters you spoke about. You all spoke about. But I just want to go on that area because within that we talked about the inclusivity aspects, cultural aspects. Alexandria, you started talking about that, but I guess this gives us the opportunity maybe to discuss a couple more points just to get our audience understanding what you think other practical considerations you have dealing with this new tech due to COVID and maybe some of the other risks that maybe popped up in the discussion that we had. So Alexander, if you could kick us off.
Thank you, Dan. Yeah, we've already discussed a little bit of this, but just to say that it's piloting something, trying new ways of doing is always very challenging in an emergency. However, WFP is an emergency-based organization, and oftentimes in the past over 60 years that the organization existed, our response was, there's an emergency struck. We send people, we send experts on the ground. We're rebuilding the roads. We're leading the emergency telecommunication cluster. We're rebuilding the connectivity. We're rebuilding everything. COVID is preventing us from doing this. So it was already a huge challenge now, even to sustain the operation, because we have such a growing needs. We were just I was just getting the numbers today in Central and West Africa region. Our caseload is around 10 million pre-COVID. This is what we were serving. The adjusted needs-based is now arrived to 57 million people who now will be in need of assistance. So we're multiplied always by 6 times. So we already need to scale up to be able to support this population with the existing resources and with the existing people, because we, for the moment, cannot even, jump on a plane and support the country offices with those assistances. So it's already very difficult to pilot something new. So that is always a risk. It's purely human resources risk that you may not have enough people to support the implementation of something new. Cultural, again, just to add another layer on it. In my part of the world, fingerprints have been much better accepted than pictures culturally. When you work in the Sahel countries, we have those traditional populations, specifically Tuareg, who are not accepting their picture being taken, and who are traditionally covering their face as well. So now if we're removing from fingerprints and we're trying to look at other means such as facial recognition, we also know that a big part of the population we serve will not be comfortable with it. And again, to explain the benefits and educate them and hear their concerns, it will be another challenge. Of course, also not to forget that the accuracy of the information will be a huge risk. The interoperability, of course, we're working a lot with HCR. We have the global data sharing agreement between our two organizations, and it's the same with IOM, where information, the data we gather should be interoperable and could be used by both organizations and at any point. That also means that we have to align on which information is being used. And as Sam just mentioned, we also have to leverage the existing database that we already have, and also look at all the technical aspects on how we can leverage the existing information, enhance it with a different type of biometrics. What we quickly did, however, since the beginning of the crisis, we basically segregated the way that we're registering the beneficiary information now. So we basically completely separated the personal information from biometric information, and we even adjusted our cards, the beneficiary cards, to be able at the second stage, when and if the biometrics could be gathered again, or a different type of biometric would be gathered, we will be able to enhance the existing information, basic information, with those biometrics, and we'll be able to enhance our tokens and our ration cards with this biometric information. So we're also now looking at how our today's actions can help the future WFP 6 months down the road, or future EN, and not just do something that we will have to restart in a few months down the road, which of course will have another resources, financial impact, costs, etc., etc. So yeah, many challenges here.
Right, and Sam, any other considerations that you want to illuminate our audience with, that as you look at the risks and practical hurdles that you have to contend with in general, I guess,
Thanks. I think a lot of the challenges that we face and the risks are very similar to those faced by WFP, so I won't repeat those. But I think there is the risk of making sure that we're still in piloting something new, something more flexible, something easy to use, one would hope, that we're not sacrificing other areas such as data privacy, accessibility for everyone concerned, not just the few who say have a smartphone or something else, and to make sure that it is culturally acceptable for the populations that we're serving. I think Alexandra touched on it as well, and I think one of the things that we are doing already is working with our partners such as WFP and other agencies to make sure that if we're using a new technology, or if we're piloting something that can be done collectively, so we take the lessons learned from each agency, and we can move forward as best as we can. I think one just final point in terms of, I guess, the alternative to piloting new technologies and making do with what we've got. I think this situation, the emergency with COVID, has made us sort of look with a critical lens on our existing equipment, and especially with the hygiene topic. I think it's been interesting to just go back to the manufacturer's sort of user guides and see where it says that you must only wipe down the surface with a clean, damp cloth and not use any disinfectants and things like this. These kind of guidelines need to be considered for the more robust environments. And going back to the example I shared, where we've taken the global part off our iris scanners in a number of operations, and it's been trying to make things field ready and adaptable for the situations in which we're working, where we can't just roll out 1,000 tripods on a moment's notice. So we need to have things which are a bit more rugged, cleanable, and adaptable to the situations in which we're working.
Right, yeah, and it's interesting you bring that up, because Jim Loudermilk was commenting in the chat the traditional hygiene for contact fingerprints or the cleaning. Alexandra talked about the difficulty of getting those supplies, as you just did, out there. And then when we look at what's in the news, even at some churches, I guess, is the use of UV and specifically UVC. But from what I've read, UVC, you can't have humans in the loop. So if you were putting this over a fingerprint scanner, you have to make sure that humans were away unless you're using far UVC, but that becomes more expensive. You both talked about the cost, and they say, based on what I read, it takes about 15 minutes in order to cleanse that zone that's affected by the UVC. Well, if you add 15 minutes between each registrant, that might really impact your operations. But now, Mick, I think you both touched on this a bit, but Mick O'Connell was asking about basically data sharing and harmonizing some of the data. As you both stated, you want to use lessons learned, and you touched a bit on data sharing, but and this is not really specific to COVID, but or maybe you have some COVID-related data sharing, but in general or specific to COVID, can you talk a bit about your successes and challenges in terms of sharing that? I mean, this is the Biometrics Institute, so that identity data, especially associated with biometrics. And now, Alexandra, let's start off with you.
Thank you, Dan. It's been you've been very gallant. I'm always stealing the star from Sam. I mean, the success pre-COVID, and I believe it was a huge party when we signed a global data sharing agreement with HCR, because it's just it has been such a journey to work together, and this data sharing agreement has been leveraged in the response to COVID, because depending on how advanced the presence of each agency is on the ground, we can piggyback or on UNHCR database, or they can get the information from us. It's not something that can come overnight. Those are the INSEE agreements, and of course also because each organization has their own internal policy on the data protection and privacy. We also need to balance with what are the national legislation in the countries that we're operating. Sometimes we have to balance between the two, although of course there are immunities for us as a UN agency, but oftentimes it could be quite helpful to look at what is possible from the government point of view, from the data sharing. Just sharing a little anecdote in Gambia for the COVID response. We actually had a project with the Gambia government years ago, where they leveraged our internal systems when they leveraged our beneficiary information management system scope a few years ago. And they finished their intervention. We'll wrap it up back in 2017. And actually, at the very beginning of the crisis, the national agency came back to us by saying, can we get the extraction of this database back in 2017, because it will be helpful for us to have access to this information, which also kind of show that how little information on vulnerable populations some governments unfortunately have because of difficulty access to those populations, that even the information back in 2017 was still relevant for them today, and that could be leveraged. So it was just quite an interesting request, and we were quite happy that we were able to help with that.
Oh, very good. Thank you. Yeah, that is, as you said, the global data sharing agreement was a big step. And I know, Sam, you discussed some of that even with outside of UN, other agencies for resettlement. I don't know, can you talked about how sharing happened, that global data sharing agreement happens within and external to UN agencies?
Sure, yeah. First of all, I think it's important to say that we differentiate between having access to our data as opposed to to transferring it sort of offshore. And I think both have their merits in different use cases. And we work with WFP and other partners in the humanitarian space and provide access to our data to a large number of partners now, so that they can benefit from the data that we've collected, and also avoid situations of multiple different agencies and entities collecting the same data from the same individuals. So I think we can all agree it's better if we just have sort of one source of the truth and not multiple databases sort of proliferating. But yeah, outside of the UN space, there's a couple of interesting case examples that are worth highlighting. So we've recently been working with the officials in Uganda to allow the SIM registration process, which for nationals involves a one-to-one verification against a biometric, which is on the national ID smart card, identity card, sorry, to be replicated for refugees. So to give the refugees, or rather to give the communications authority the same level of assurance that someone who is a refugee who is registering for a SIM card, that they have the same level of assurance on that identity. So now from any of the 160,000 or so kiosks across the country, with the existing scanners and the existing M&O apps, the data which is collected there can be pushed and checked against the data which is jointly held by HCR and the government. So that's been a great step forward for us. And then I think on the resettlement front, I think Dan, you mentioned an example there which we're quite proud of. So we've given access to our actual tools, so our hardware and our software to partners from resettlement states who are looking to make use of the data that we've got on our individuals who are registered with us. So we've piloted with the US, and they very generously gave us some funding to advance in this area. In addition to this, giving them our tools so that they could do identity verifications in the field as part of pre-departure interviews and assessments, we've also been working to automate the transfer of data to the states for cases which have been which are getting accepted and going down the road for a settlement. So just to be clear, this is data for individuals who have consented to share their data with the US and any other resettlement state, who otherwise would have to be fingerprinted at a later stage during the process. So it's helped us to ensure a continuity of identity throughout the whole chain of identity, and to speed up the process, really, to make sure that both we and the resettlement states that we're working with can serve a greater number of people each year and get a greater number of people resettled. So yeah, we're proud of those examples. It's no easy thing to do, though. So my closing note on data sharing, it's obviously a lot of things to think about, an enormously long legal process to get anything up and running, and to make sure we're giving proper and full consideration to the data protection risks before we embark on any new venture.
Yeah, and thanks for adding that with only data sharing with consent. Yeah, that's pretty huge. It's benefiting the individual, and it's at their behest that data is being shared. Thank you. And breaking news, this just in. Francois mentioned that he found some research around the use of UVC taking under a minute, in some cases 30 seconds to exposure to get rid of 99.9% or to kill 99.9% of the virus. So I think we're going to see more of that. And I mean, even and that's great. And if it's down to 30 seconds, that I think is manageable. But if you're on CBP primary and the whole operation is supposed to take 90 seconds, and now you're dealing with a third of it. Anyhow, I mean, it's great that the technology and that is advancing, and something we all need to keep an eye out on. And it looks like we're right at half past. I don't know. Isabel, is there time for any closing remarks, or should we from our panelists, or should we just end it here?
Go for it. I think this is fascinating. We said we have allowed a bit of time for chatting. There is obviously a few questions, so
Oh, okay.
feel free to do that. There was one to UNHCR, and I'm not quite sure if we had answered that. It was a little bit earlier on from one of our UK members. Sorry, I'm scrolling back trying to find it. I would like to know more how UNHCR makes self-service work. So I don't know if we had responded to that, Sam. Is that something you could comment on? Do you need more
and if I
details?
could, I think, Sam, one of the points that you made there, and maybe reiterated if it's still not clear, is self-service doesn't necessarily mean remote. And so what that meant to me, and maybe you could talk a bit about this, when you say self-service, that's when you're at a refugee point or a station, or what exactly do you mean when you said that self-service doesn't necessarily mean remote?
Yeah, that's right. So in addition to what I think most people would think when we say self-service, we are looking at other ways. So kiosks that can be installed or making available shared workspaces that people can go to. Obviously, not quite so much with COVID, but places that people can go to access services without just needing to see a person. And where it's routine, just sharing of information, printing of documentation, and things like this, we believe we can deliver a lot of our services without needing that human interaction, provided we can still have that level of assurance on identity. So this is what we're working towards at the moment, as I say, across a number of areas. And yeah, I saw the comment come up, and I'd be glad to talk in more detail about it with that individual or anyone else for that matter after the panel.
But I guess maybe just as we wrap up, maybe we could talk about how COVID, we think post-COVID is going to change the way we do things forever. Post-COVID, like lessons learned, like the cleansing, the hygiene, maybe technology. I mean, maybe as a closing, if you could each speak to that, what do you see as a permanent artifact of us dealing with this emergency response, and in your day-to-day, and it could be, as we said, the processes, the policies, or the technology. And once again, ladies first, Alexandra, I'll ask you, just a minute or two to close out the session.
Thank you so much, Dan. No, I believe it's exactly what you said, is of course the reinforced hygiene practices. I do believe it's even outside of our operations. I see in your personal life, like you're washing the hands and putting a mask, becoming natural. Just spoke with friends this weekend, and they're amazed to see their 3-year-old washing his hands without being reminded every time he's coming from outside. So I do believe the situation changed us all from this perspective. I also see that we will be looking into maybe more naturally into contactless type of technologies, which I don't believe was the priority before necessarily. As far as WFP was concerned, we were looking for something that was robust. Again, the equipment has to work in very drastic conditions, in a desert when it's 60 degrees and it's sandy, and it has to be quite robust. So that was pretty much the criteria, and it has to be cost efficient, and it has to be easy to use. Now we'll be adding yet another minimal criteria, which is as contactless as possible, or as resistant to those hygiene or alcohol-based solutions as possible, easily washable, etc., etc. So I think that will be changing us quite forever. And and also the fact that we will have to pay more attention into what Sam just said in the beginning on how can we face the distances, how can we reduce crowding. Most likely, that will change us forever. However, we've already been through the Ebola crisis, and we were also having similar hopes back in time, which was not necessarily translated into reality. So let's see. Well, if it's for the moment is just a wishful thinking, and in a couple of months we'll just go back to normal. But I believe some of those new criteria will be definitely here.
Okay, thank you. And Sam.
Thanks. I think flexibility would be the one word I would use to describe our way forward from now. And I think being receptive and responsive to multimodal solutions in the future, switching between modes for different use cases, to really consider contactless, and in being more flexible to our populations, really make more effort to make sure we are being as inclusive as we can be in response to different situations, and yeah, make use of technology to make that happen.
Very good. And Mahus, I don't know, from your research, do you see do you see findings coming out of research that you say, aha, this is going to become mainstream now that COVID has triggered this type of thought or this type of reaction, in this area? I mean, one that maybe you could speak to, and Patrick will as well, is one of the things that I was confronted with is people in certain jobs have to get background checks, like in the UK and in the US, FBI background checks, right? And FBI background checks require FBI Appendix F certified devices, which are all contact to do that. Well, how are we going to do background checks for child welfare workers with that requirement? Do you see any technology advances in your research that could put these contactless devices in for Appendix F, which are forensic quality that you could use for one-to-end searches? I mean, what have you seen there, if anything?
Well, in terms of research and quality, obviously there is a lot of research going on to improve the quality of capturing biometric modalities overall and improve the performance. The simple example is face recognition. Over the last few years, we see tremendous improvement in face recognition. I had in front of me one of the studies which shows that we have 1,000 times reduction in false positive rate in 8 years, starting between 2010, I would say, 2018 or 19 time frame. So this is extraordinary, and this will keep happening in different modalities, and and also this is a international effort. We need to improve the way we capture the devices, adapt the optics or different sensors, and adapt the technology too. Now, regarding the the operational side, I think the best people to answer the questions of how to deal with this matter, while the research will follow later on and improve the quality of capture and algorithmic performance improvement, verified by NIST, right? Is you have to ask the FBI or the all those organizations that are doing a magnificent job, and they have to find ways to adopt the new norm. If you would ask me, while in these cases flexibility can be a way to move forward, I would say more responsibility and flexibility can be a better way to move forward, because now we have to change policies and then research will follow. We have to change procedures. We have to follow new guidelines. We have new findings for COVID-19 as we speak, and of course things will change in the way we interact and where we capture modalities and adapt to the new norm. So from the academics, if I would give you something that is more from my personal experience as an academician, things change in this perspective on an everyday activities in academy. Data collection activities have been suspended, close contact, and the IRBs have to be updated. We have stop work orders from existing projects. They're not completely stopped, but the work has stopped. And new guidelines have to be followed. There is an uncertainty about the future. So there are a lot of things are happening. So hopefully guidelines in the government or those organizations that are in the front lines, I'm sure they're working on all those problems, while at the same time getting input and advice or suggestions from the academics on what new technology we need to be using.
Wow.
Yes. All right. Well, great. Thanks. And you mentioned the use of facial recognition, and you threw in policy changes, which, right. So in my example of the background checks, it's required that they're fingerprint based at this point.
Wow.
Unless there's policy changes. And then on facial recognition, there's questions on masks. Now, maybe I know too much about UNHCR, and Sam and I talked about this briefly. They collect facial images, but they're not doing facial recognition. The same thing with Alexandra, but they do register faces for human inspection. And I believe Sam confirmed that when they're registering faces, they do ask you for the mask to be taken off for that process. And I know Patrick was going to talk about the impact of masks on facial recognition. We might have to leave it
there, Dan. Because, yes, absolutely. We're coming to that in the next session. Look, fantastic. Thank you all so much for doing this. We could see even from the chat, we could just keep going on and on. It was interesting. I had a conversation with Jim Wayman recently, because we're looking as well at bringing Jim online to deliver our introduction biometrics training course online. And so I was chatting to him about this NIST study on the fingerprints, because Patrick had actually put me in touch with a gentleman at NIST in charge of that study, and I was hoping to have him here today, but we have more opportunities for more meetings. But Jim pointed out there are actually some older studies on fingerprints and contactless that are well worth a read. So we did look, Mahos, at those links as well, and I think we did put them into our hygiene paper in the end when we got those. So we will look at this a lot more and come back to this whole discussion. But for now, right on time. Dan, fantastic job. Alexandra, thank you so much for joining us. Sam, I hope it's not too hot where you are now. The UK has wonderful yesterday, 32.6 degrees Celsius at Heathrow Airport.
Wow.
Bring it on. I don't need to go to Australia anymore. It's this warm here. So thank you all. What we're going to do is we're going to have our little digital break. So basically stay on the call also for our delegates there, but we give you an opportunity to go and get a glass of wine, a cup of coffee, in my case, a sandwich, and then we'll be back right on the hour for our second session. But you know, all wonderful friends of the Institute, we did a briefing a few days ago. It is so good to see you all. And I wish we could all put our cameras on, but that might get a little crowded. So thank you, and we'll be back shortly.